By the second half of 1942, capture in the Pacific War had begun to take on a new meaning. It was no longer an isolated accident of battle. On islands like Guadalcanal, where fighting erupted in August and ground on into early 1943, Japanese units were being worn down not by decisive blows but by exhaustion, disease, and the slow collapse of supply. Men who had landed expecting short campaigns now found themselves trapped in jungle terrain that offered no food, no medicine, and no clear line of retreat. The doctrine they carried into battle had prepared them to fight to death, not to endure starvation while waiting for orders that never came. When surrender finally occurred, it rarely looked dramatic. It happened at the edges of strength. A wounded soldier emerging from cover, a patrol discovered too weak to resist, a small group separated from its unit, no longer capable of movement. For these men, capture was not a choice in any meaningful sense. It was the moment when the body failed before belief could catch up. Training emphasized death over surrender, but training did not stop malaria, infected wounds, or weeks without food. The first moments under American control contradicted everything they expected. There were no executions, no immediate beatings. Instead, there was silence broken by commands, hands searching bodies, weapons taken away and placed out of reach. The process felt impersonal. Names were not asked for. Rank was not acknowledged. The prisoners were handled as objects to be secured rather than enemies to be punished. For men raised to expect annihilation, this absence of violence was deeply unsettling. Almost immediately, attention shifted to their condition. Wounds were examined. Those who could not stand were separated without explanation and moved to shaded areas or temporary aid stations. Water was issued, not generously, but reliably. The difference mattered. On campaign, water had often been a gamble, found, stolen, or gone. Here, it appeared as part of a process that did not react to individual pleading. It simply operated. Many prisoners arrived in catastrophic physical shape. Malnutrition was common. Skin infections had gone untreated for months. Shrapnel wounds were wrapped with dirty cloth or ignored entirely. Malaria, dysentery, and fever were routine companions. In American custody, these conditions were no longer invisible. Bodies were inspected systematically. Lice were removed. Clothing was taken away for cleaning or destruction. Men were washed whether they resisted or not. Quarantine was enforced, not as mercy, but as containment. This was the first real shock, not kindness, but method. Medical instruments were cleaned, bandages were replaced, temperatures were taken and written down. Time returned in the form of schedules. Sick men were checked again the next day, and the day after that. On the battlefield, illness had been a slow sentence. Here, it became a condition to be monitored. Transport deepened the disorientation. Prisoners were moved from forward areas to rear holding facilities, then onto ships bound away from the front. Many expected these journeys to be fatal. Instead, even below decks, patterns held. Meals arrived. Water was rationed but consistent. Guards enforced discipline but not randomness. Men who collapsed were removed and treated, not discarded. Survival no longer depended on improvisation or luck. It depended on compliance with a system that showed no emotion either way. Psychologically, this created strain. Capture had been imagined as an ending. What followed felt like continuation without meaning. The system did not insult them, but it also did not acknowledge their beliefs. It simply absorbed them. Identification numbers replaced names. Paperwork followed them from camp to camp. Their existence was being recorded, preserved, and managed. By the time prisoners reached more permanent facilities, one truth was unavoidable. This was not temporary detention. The structure extended far beyond the island where they had been captured. Whatever awaited them next had already been prepared, and within that preparation lay the first daily ritual that would define captivity. Not interrogation, not punishment, but the arrival of food measured by the clock, rather than the chaos of war. The first permanent camps did not announce themselves through words. They revealed their nature through repetition. Barbed wire framed the horizon, guard towers established distance. But what defined daily life almost immediately was sound and movement tied to a schedule. Footsteps at the same hour, lines forming without shouting, containers opening in sequence. Food arrived not as relief, but as certainty. For men who had lived for months on shrinking rations, this certainty was destabilizing. On campaign, hunger had never followed rules. It appeared suddenly, lingered endlessly, and vanished only when something, anything, could be eaten. Rice disappeared first. Then canned supplies, then even substitutes failed. Hunger became a constant pressure rather than an event. In the camps, that pressure eased, not because the food was familiar, but because it arrived whether they deserved it or not. The meals themselves were strange. Bread replaced rice, potatoes appeared in bulk, coffee, dark and bitter, arrived steaming in containers that moved down the line without pause. Meat came canned or cooked in ways many prisoners had never seen. Portions were not generous, but they were consistent. Ladles stopped at the same level. No man received more because of rank. No man received less because of resistance. The system did not negotiate. This regularity altered behavior almost immediately. At first, prisoners ate quickly, expecting scarcity to return. Some hid pieces of bread, only to discover the next meal arrived on time regardless. Gradually, hoarding faded. Men stopped watching the line ahead of them. They began watching the clock instead. Hunger did not vanish, but it lost its urgency. For the first time in months, eating did not feel like a race against collapse. U.S. camp policy treated food as infrastructure. Calories were calculated to maintain body weight and prevent illness. Prisoners who arrived severely malnourished were monitored closely, portions adjusted to avoid shock. Weight gain was recorded. Decline was investigated. This was not sympathy. It was prevention. A starving camp bred sickness and unrest. A fed camp could be controlled. The psychological effect of this approach was profound. Many prisoners had been taught that the enemy would degrade them, starve them, or use hunger as punishment. Instead, food arrived independently of behavior. Refusal to work did not result in starvation. Compliance did not bring reward. Meals appeared with mechanical indifference. That indifference carried a message more unsettling than cruelty. Survival was no longer tied to honor or resistance. It was automatic. Some prisoners resisted eating at first, attempting to preserve a sense of agency. Most could not sustain it. Hunger stripped away abstraction. Acceptance came quietly, often without comment. Once it did, comparison followed. Men compared camp meals to what they had eaten during the final weeks of battle. Roots, insects, scraps pulled from abandoned positions. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Shame did not disappear, but it shifted inward. Conversations in the barracks reflected this tension. Prisoners speculated about how long the food would last. Some believed it was temporary, meant only to prepare them for labor. Others suspected deception. Yet day after day, the pattern held. Breakfast, midday, evening. The body adjusted even as the mind resisted. Guards did not explain the system. They enforced it. Silence accompanied distribution. Orders were brief. Movement was controlled. The absence of commentary reinforced the sense that food was not a gesture. It was a component. Just as fencing defined space and rules defined movement, meals defined time. Only gradually did prisoners begin to understand that nourishment was not an end. It was the foundation. Strength returned. Weight stabilized. Hands stopped shaking. And with that recovery came attention to other neglected aspects of the body. Because once hunger was managed, the camp turned its focus to illness. Systematically, relentlessly, through a process that many prisoners would later remember as even more unsettling than the food itself. Once hunger was no longer the dominant problem, the body began revealing what the battlefield had concealed. Illness surfaced slowly at first, then all at once. Fevers that had been endured without treatment now demanded attention. Infected wounds that had been ignored out of necessity spread under the skin. In the camps, these conditions did not remain private. They were identified, recorded, and addressed through a process that followed schedule rather than circumstance. Sick call was announced without ceremony. Names were taken. Symptoms were noted. Men were examined in sequence, not urgency. Those deemed unfit were removed from the barracks flow and sent to infirmaries that functioned according to U.S. Army medical procedure. For prisoners accustomed to improvisation and neglect, the experience felt intrusive. Bodies were handled without regard for rank or personal history. Authority rested entirely with medical staff who did not explain themselves. The difference from frontline experience was immediate. On campaign, illness had been something to be concealed for as long as possible. Reporting sickness meant being left behind or marked as weak. In captivity, concealment failed quickly. Daily inspections revealed fevers, swelling, and exhaustion. Men were isolated not as punishment, but as containment. Quarantine wards separated contagious cases before outbreaks could spread. The logic was impersonal and absolute. Treatment followed the same pattern. Wounds were cleaned repeatedly, not once. Bandages were replaced on schedule. Infections were monitored rather than guessed at. Malaria cases were identified and managed instead of endured. Dental care, absent for many prisoners since enlistment, became routine. Teeth were extracted under sterile conditions. Pain was treated as a problem to be solved, not a test of endurance. Sanitation reinforced the system's intent. Latrines were inspected. Hands were washed under supervision. Clothing and bedding were laundered and deloused at regular intervals. These rules were enforced with discipline, sometimes with punishment for non-compliance. The purpose was not to comfort prisoners. It was to prevent disease from destabilizing the camp. Guards and prisoners occupied the same environment. Infection threatened both. The effect on prisoners was unsettling. Men who had expected slow decline found themselves recovering. Weight returned. Fevers broke. Skin healed. Strength that had been lost to hunger and illness began to reappear. This recovery created a psychological burden. Survival no longer felt accidental. It felt imposed. The body responded even as belief resisted. For some, this created resentment. Treatment was seen as preparation for forced labor or prolonged detention. Others feared experimentation or hidden motives. In reality, the system was bureaucratic rather than sinister. Healthy prisoners were easier to manage. Sick prisoners required resources and attention. Medical care reduced unrest before it appeared. Every injection, every inspection served stability. The presence of structured medicine also altered internal dynamics. Rank dissolved inside infirmaries. Officers and enlisted men waited side by side. Decisions were final and unchallenged. Japanese command structures had no authority in this space. For men trained to equate hierarchy with order, this flattening was deeply disorienting. Identity lost its usual anchors. At the same time, recovery sharpened awareness. The physical fog of starvation and disease lifted, leaving clarity in its place. Prisoners had more energy to think, to observe, to compare. The system they lived under was not accidental. It was deliberate, sustained, and scalable. Camps functioned as planned environments, not holding pens. As weeks turned into months, sick call became routine rather than shock. Men learned when inspections would occur. They learned the consequences of noncompliance. They learned that illness no longer meant disappearance. It meant documentation and return. This predictability, more than the treatment itself, altered how prisoners understood captivity. Gradually, a connection became unavoidable. Food restored strength. Medicine preserved it, and neither existed without expectation. The camps were not designed to keep men idle indefinitely. Once bodies stabilized and illness was contained, attention shifted toward how that restored strength would be used. Because the next phase of captivity was not recovery. It was work. Work began without ceremony. Notices appeared. Names were called. Men who had been marked medically fit were separated from those still under observation, then assigned to details that followed the same logic governing everything else inside the camp: order, repetition, supervision. Kitchens needed labor. Barracks required maintenance. Grounds had to be cleared and repaired. In larger camp systems and branch camps tied to agriculture or logistics, work extended beyond the wire under armed guard. The transition from patient to worker happened quietly. as if it had always been the next step. By this stage, most prisoners understood the structure they were inside. Food had restored strength, medical care had stabilized it. Work gave that strength direction. This relationship was never explained, but it was consistently enforced. Men who worked received the same rations as those who did not, but illness or refusal brought scrutiny. Fitness evaluations determined assignment. Injury removed a man from duty, but only temporarily. The expectation was not loyalty or enthusiasm, it was participation. For Japanese POWs, this arrangement carried unfamiliar meaning. On campaign, labor had been inseparable from desperation, digging under fire, hauling supplies without rest, repairing positions while shells fell nearby. There had been no schedules, only exhaustion. In captivity, labor came with limits. Hours were fixed. Tools were issued and counted. Breaks existed. Injuries were documented and treated. This did not make the work easy, but it made it predictable. That predictability itself was disorienting. U.S. camp commanders viewed work as stabilization. Idle prisoners concentrated tension, they argued, formed factions, and tested authority. Structured labor reduced these risks. It occupied time. It drained excess energy. It reinforced routine. Guard units enforced compliance, but the emphasis remained administrative rather than punitive. Discipline was consistent. Infractions brought confinement. Loss of privileges or transfer, not random violence. The system relied on consequence rather than fear. Inside the compounds, reactions divided sharply. Some prisoners adapted quickly, treating work as a way to pass time and preserve strength. They focused on the task, avoided attention, and measured days by completion rather than resistance. Others resisted in subtle ways, slowing pace, feigning illness, performing tasks poorly when possible. A smaller group refused outright, clinging to pre-war codes that rejected cooperation in any form. These refusals did not stop the system. They only isolated the men who attempted them. These differences created internal friction. Prisoners who worked were accused of collaboration. Those who refused were seen as liabilities, drawing guard attention and tightening restrictions for entire barracks. Old hierarchies struggled to survive under these conditions. Authority based on rank or ideology mattered less than compliance and health. Camp administrators discouraged prisoner-led command structures when they threatened order, breaking groups apart through reassignment or transfer. Food and medical care remained constant throughout. Rations did not increase as reward, nor were they withheld as punishment. This consistency reinforced the central message of captivity. The system did not bargain. It functioned. Participation kept it smooth. Resistance created friction that the system absorbed and neutralized without altering its core practices. Over time, work reshaped how prisoners experienced themselves. Strength was no longer something hoarded against death. It was something spent under observation. Days were measured by tasks completed and inspections passed, rather than battles survived. Survival lost its heroic or defiant meaning. It became administrative. As routine settled deeper, a quieter struggle emerged. If survival was no longer contested daily, then the real conflict shifted inward. Prisoners began to question not whether they would live, but what that continued life now represented. That question, unspoken but persistent, would define the later months of captivity more than hunger or illness ever had. By late 1943 and into 1944, captivity had ceased to feel temporary. The routines that once shocked Japanese prisoners, meals on schedule, medical inspections, work details, had settled into the body. With that settlement came a quieter, more corrosive conflict. Survival was no longer an emergency. It was an ongoing condition, and that forced a reckoning with beliefs formed long before capture. Shame did not disappear. It changed form. It became internal, carried in posture and silence, rather than open resistance. Some prisoners attempted to preserve military identity within the wire, maintaining rank distinctions, formal address, and ritualized discipline inside the barracks. Others withdrew entirely, minimizing speech and movement, choosing invisibility over confrontation. The system made both strategies fragile. The camp flattened hierarchy through routine, Food and medical care arrived without regard for status. Work assignments ignored former rank. Identity that depended on command struggled to survive in an environment built around compliance. Information seeped in unevenly. Guard remarks, official notices, and Red Cross communications hinted at defeats across the Pacific. Each fragment narrowed the distance between captivity and inevitability. For prisoners raised to believe surrender erased honor, the prospect of return created new fear. Survival in enemy hands raised questions that had no answers inside the camp. Going home meant explaining endurance in a culture that had glorified death. Internal tensions reflected this pressure. Prisoners accused one another of softness or betrayal. Work became a moral fault line. Those who adapted were watched by those who refused. Men who accepted medical exemptions or lighter duties faced suspicion. Resistance, when it appeared, was often symbolic rather than effective. Small acts meant to assert agency rather than disrupt operations. Camp authorities observed closely, intervening when disputes threatened order. Transfers, separations, and reassignments broke up clusters of hostility before they could harden. Adaptation continued regardless. Bodies recovered, minds adjusted. The system demanded neither gratitude nor conversion, only predictability. Over time, some prisoners reframed captivity as suspension rather than disgrace. It was not the battlefield. It was not home. It was an imposed interval governed by rules that did not require belief to function. In that space, survival lost its moral charge. It became neutral. Neutrality brought its own burden. Waiting replaced struggle. Waiting for news. Waiting for transport. Waiting for a war that now felt distant but decisive. Routine, once imposed, became a coping mechanism. The very regularity that had unsettled prisoners early on now provided structure against anxiety. Days passed without incident. Weeks blurred. The body learned to live inside a system designed to endure. As 1944 gave way to 1945, subtle shifts signaled change. Inspections emphasized records more than discipline. Medical evaluations focused on documentation. Work schedules adjusted. The machinery of captivity did not break down. It prepared to disengage. Prisoners sensed it before it was confirmed. The routines that had defined daily life were loosening, not through neglect, but through completion. The question that remained was no longer how to survive captivity. It was how to carry it forward. Food and medical care had preserved bodies. Routine had preserved order. What remained unresolved was meaning. And as the war approached its end, that unresolved weight would follow prisoners out of the camps and back toward a country they barely recognized. By mid-1945, the structure of captivity began to change in ways that did not require explanation. Work details shortened. Roll calls emphasized verification rather than discipline. Medical inspections multiplied, not to restore strength but to document it. Files thickened. Names were checked and rechecked against lists that now pointed outward instead of inward. The camp still functioned, but its purpose was shifting from containment to conclusion. When news of Japan's surrender reached the camps in August 1945, it did not arrive as celebration behind the wire. There were no cheers, no visible release of emotion. For many prisoners, the war had already ended in stages, first with hunger, then with capture, then with the slow realization that survival would continue regardless of belief. The announcement confirmed what routine had been quietly signaling. Captivity was no longer indefinite. Processing replaced enforcement. Men were examined, weighed, and cleared for transport. Medical records followed them forward. Evidence of wounds treated, diseases contained, bodies stabilized. The same system that had once imposed routine now prepared to dissolve it. For prisoners, this transition was unsettling. The camp had been a closed world, governed by predictable rules. Release meant movement into uncertainty, not immediate freedom. As repatriation plans took shape through late 1945, contrast sharpened memory. Prisoners learned, sometimes from guards, sometimes from delayed reports, of conditions in Japan. Cities destroyed. Infrastructure shattered. Food scarce. Disease widespread. The realization landed quietly, but heavily. The predictable meals and enforced sanitation of captivity stood in stark opposition to the shortages awaiting them at home. What they had noticed first, food that arrived on time, medical care that functioned regardless of allegiance, now returned with new meaning. For U.S. authorities, the camps were administrative systems that had run their course. Records, inspections, and Red Cross oversight framed them as lawful operations governed by policy rather than impulse. For the prisoners, memory was less orderly. Captivity had not erased shame, but it had complicated it. Survival had been imposed, sustained by systems that valued stability over vengeance. The enemy had not sought to convert them. It had sought to manage them, and in doing so had preserved lives that doctrine had prepared to discard. Departure came without ceremony. Ships replaced barracks. Guard towers receded. The routines that had once defined each day fell away one by one. Yet the body carried their imprint. Hunger no longer meant immediate collapse. Illness no longer meant abandonment. The memory of order, of a system that fed and treated enemies because it functioned better that way, remained. Return did not resolve that memory. In a devastated homeland, where food was rationed and medical supplies thin, captivity became a point of comparison that could not be spoken easily. Some prisoners remained silent. Others struggled to reconcile endurance with expectation. The camps faded from public discussion, but not from personal recollection. They lingered in small details: the sound of a ladle stopping at the same point each day, the habit of washing hands before meals, the awareness that survival had once arrived on schedule. What Japanese prisoners noticed first in American custody, food, and medical care was never just about comfort. It was about control, predictability, and the unsettling realization that survival could be separated from belief. That realization did not end with release. It followed them home, unresolved. A quiet reminder that the war had concluded not only through destruction, but through systems designed to endure when everything else collapsed.